I don't know about you, but my prayer list is longer than it ever has been before. And it's not just longer with more people. There's more serious things that I'm praying for those I care about. I don't know, maybe you feel the same way. No doubt this virus that we're going through has brought a lot of changes, has brought a lot of things on our prayer list, both with the virus and things that are happening in this world. But there's a lot of people that we care about that are going through serious things. Fighting disease, going through pain and suffering, great pain and anguish. And it might be that it's not just the people going through the pain that we have in our prayers and on our hearts. It might be those that are caring for those. That can be just as hard and challenging, even if it's not happening to you, that it's happening to one of your close loved ones. That can be very challenging. But here's the good news of that. The Bible dedicates not just some passages, it dedicates an entire book to pain and suffering. It's a book that's contained in a section of the Bible we call wisdom literature, giving us God's wisdom, God's revelation about how to handle, as God's children, those very difficult times of suffering. Not only is it a book of wisdom, it is a book of poetry. The book of Job is one of the most beautifully written books in all of the Bible. A lot of people have watched or like to rewatch that show. I call it Downtown Abbey. I know it's not downtown, but Downton Abbey. And one of the reasons that it's so endearing is just to see how people talked back in those days to one another. I don't know, it seems so classy and civil. And the thing about the book of Job, the way that they talk and the way that they form sentences and ideas and thought, it's poetry. It's just beautiful. And the fact that they're arguing and criticizing one another as they do it is even more amazing to me. But I thought it'd be a timely lesson because, one, this is what I've been doing in my daily Bible reading, going through the book of Job. And I just thought, with all this pain and anguish and suffering going on, let's just do a lesson from the book of Job about some things of how, or just what Job tells us about this book of pain and suffering. And so that's what we're going to do as we talk about how to wrestle with pain, suffering, anguish, trials. So what we're going to do, we have several points. I'm going to hit them relatively quickly. We're going to read quite a few scriptures to illustrate this and to just get a sense of the beauty of how this is all said. So point number one, and if you haven't done so already, you can turn to the book of Job chapter 1. That's going to be our beginning place. Number one, the book of Job tells us that God allows his people to suffer. That's a tough concept for a lot of people, that God allows his people to suffer. In fact, it is the number one reason why people stop believing in God. It is the number one criticism and point that is made against believing in God. You ask just about any atheist, this will be the first thing that he brings about. God is challenged in his love and his existence and his power because God allows his people to suffer. But not because he doesn't care about us. It's not because it's a character flaw or a lack of power or a misunderstanding of love. God, number one, allows us to suffer as a test. As a test. Let's take a look at Job chapter 1, verse 8 and 9. Job 1, verse 8 and 9. This is a conversation Yahweh is having with Satan. The Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job? For there is no one like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man, fearing God and turning away from evil." Then Satan answered the Lord, "Does Job fear God for nothing?" So I want you to notice that God says, hey, what about Job? What do you think about Job? And Satan says, well, yeah, he's good, faithful. It's just because you've built this hedge around him. You blessed him with all these things. So I want you to notice that God allows Satan to test Job and his faithfulness. In fact, the book of Job is about two of these tests, right? The first test, the first challenge, is pretty quick. It's chapter 1. A lot happens to Job in that first test, but it's quickly told. And Job passes with flying colors. The second test is the rest of the book. And only one thing happens to Job. He's inflicted with these terrible, terrible sickness and boils. And so the rest of the book is really about him dealing with this second test and having to deal not only with the suffering of the disease, of the boils, but the suffering of those around him like his friends. But I want you to understand, the fact that we know that God allows us to suffer to test us, and not only to test us, God allows it because it can, when we conquer, when we withstand, it can make us stronger. Yes, stronger physically, yes, stronger mentally, but most importantly, it is designed to make us stronger spiritually. And so the point that I want to make is that when we understand God allows, and that's a test, then it helps us with that perspective. As I've said many times before, it's a perspective that when trials come upon us, when we're going through that pain and suffering, I know it's not easy, but it's an opportunity to really pour out your heart, your love, your loyalty. Look at it as an opportunity to shine forth for God. It's like when his apostles were beaten for preaching Jesus Christ and then released. Remember when they were released? What did they do? They rejoiced. Yeah, they were in pain. And they were bloody. And they were bruised up. For no crime at all. But they rejoiced because they were found worthy to suffer for the cause of Christ. It was a great perspective that they had, and one that's going to turn everything around and cause you to react in that pain and suffering in the right way, with the right attitude. Point number 2. The book of Job teaches us that God isn't always bringing the test. Let's say in Job chapter 1, let's look at 12. The Lord said to Satan, "Behold, all that he has is in your power. Only do not put forth your hand on him." So Satan departed from the presence of the Lord. And we know exactly what Satan does in chapter 1 and chapter 2. What I want to get across to you is that there's a difference between allowing suffering and bringing the suffering. The amazing thing in the book of Job is that I can't remember a single time in the entire book where either Job or his friends attribute or even open the door that what's happening to Job could be from Satan. He's completely out of the book. It's always from the standpoint of God. Why is God doing this to me, says Job. His friends saying, God is doing this to you, Job, because of this reason. Now, I think there's an answer to that. I think because ultimately they know, point number one, that God is allowing it. And so in that perspective, yeah, it is God. Even though it might come from Satan or one of his servants. But it's a good point to understand and to make, because there's a lot of people, when there's pain and suffering and anguish, they start blaming God. They start disbelieving in God. They start losing their confidence and their faith in God. There's a difference between allowing and bringing. And if we don't understand why God allows it, then we're probably not going to react the right way. We're probably not going to conquer it. In James chapter 1 and in verse 13, James says, "Let no one say when he is tempted, I am being tempted by God. For God cannot be tempted by evil, and he himself does not tempt anyone." There's a difference between allowing and tempting. And the book of Job brings out that perspective to help us. All right, point number 3. I think this is such an important point. The book of Job teaches us that as we're going through that anguish, it's all right to cry, to mourn, to weep, to complain. Job shows us that when we are suffering, when we're feeling intense pain, when we're experiencing agony, it's all right to let it out. And I think that's an important point from the book of Job, because a lot of times I think that some have this idea that when people complain in their anguish, in their pain, that it's a sign of a lack of faith. But I don't think that's what the book of Job teaches us. Let's look at Job chapter 3. Job 3, and we're going to start in verse 1. Job chapter 3, verse 1. Look at the complaint of Job. Afterward, Job opened his mouth and cursed the day of his birth. And Job said, "Let the day perish on which I was to be born, and the night which said, a boy is conceived. May that day be darkness. Let not God above care for it, nor light shine on it. Let darkness and black gloom claim it. Let a cloud settle on it. Let the blackness of the day terrify it." Look at verse 11, same chapter, verse 11. "Why did I not die at birth? Come forth from the womb and expire?" Verse 20. "Why is light given to him who suffers?" Do you realize these are the first words Job speaks in the second challenge, the second test? He curses the day of his birth. What if your loved one going through trials, going through pain and agony, cursed the day of their birth? What would you think? What would your reaction be? Well, that's going too far. Look at Job chapter 7, verse 11. Job chapter 7 and verse 11. "Therefore," Job says, "therefore I will not restrain my mouth. I will speak in the anguish of my spirit. I will complain in the bitterness of my soul." Job says, I'm going to let it out. Because that's what you do when you're in pain and anguish. Look at Job chapter 10, verse 1. Not only did he curse the day of his birth, look at this. "I loathe my own life. I will give full vent to my complaint. I will speak in the bitterness of my soul. I will say to God, do not condemn me. Let me know why you contend with me. Is it right for you indeed to oppress, to reject the labor of your hands, and to look favorably on the schemes of the wicked?" Look at verse 18, same chapter, verse 18 and 19. Why then have you brought me out of the womb? Would that I had died, and no eye had seen me. I should have been as though I had not been, carried from womb to tomb. From womb to tomb. Those are some pretty mournful words, aren't they? But look at what he's going through. And his friends are absolutely no help. They revile him for such words. Now, I think there needs to be balance in that. We're going to talk about the ultimate goal at the end. We need to be careful of exactly what we say about God. But he even says, God, why are you doing this? It's not fair, God. But that's what happens when people are in anguish. They cry out. As we like to say, they let it out. And sometimes that's what's necessary. It's okay to do that, says the book of Job. Just look at the book of Psalms. How much crying out and complaining is there in the book of Psalms? A whole lot. But in the end, it's a cry for God's help, not a denial of God's strength. There's a whole book written by the prophet Jeremiah called Lamentation, where he cries out to God in lament, in deep, deep sorrow. Point number 4. The book of Job teaches us that as we go through pain and anguish and suffering and trial, God doesn't tell us all the information. When you look at the book of Job, Job's suffering was part of it. Part of what was added to that suffering was not knowing why God was allowing this to happen. His friends definitely believed they knew why it was happening, but Job knew that wasn't the answer. It was something else, but he didn't know what else it was. In addition to that, Job didn't know where God was. He kept praying. He kept crying out, and there was no answer. Let's stay in chapter 10. Look at chapter 10. And each of these readings is the same verses 8 and 9. But we're going to change up the chapter. So Job 10, verse 8 and 9. Job says, your hands fashioned and made all together. And would you destroy me? Remember now that you have made me as clay. And would you turn me into dust again? Again, questioning God, why? Why, God? Why is this happening? Why are you doing this to me? Look at Job 23, same verses 8 and 9. Job 23, 8 and 9. Job says, I can't find God. I don't know where he is. Behold, I go forward, but he is not there. And backward, but I cannot perceive him. When he acts on the left, I cannot behold him. When he turns on the right, I cannot see him. Where, God, are you? Have you ever felt that way? God, where are you? Enough is enough. Verses 8 and 9 in Job 6. Job's chapter 6, same verses 8 and 9. Job says here, oh, that my requests might come to pass, and that God would grant my longing. Would that God were willing to crush me, that he would loose his hand and cut me off. That's kind of both those points put together. He's kind of crying out to God that God end his life, crush him. But in a sense, he's like, but where is God? And that's one of the most difficult things, is not knowing. I think most Christians would be like, okay, I can take this, God. I can handle this. But the anguish is added to it, not knowing, when's it going to end? What is God's plan here? Being patient is hard. Not knowing. I think it was my first year here. The ladies had a ladies' Bible class on Sunday morning. You remember the theme of that Bible class? It was a great theme, a great idea. It was all about waiting on the Lord. Remember that? Waiting on the Lord. That's what we have to do sometimes, and it can add to the suffering because God doesn't always tell us all the information. Job didn't know why. He knew why it wasn't happening, but he didn't know why it was happening. All right, next point. I think we're on 4. This point is a key point. This is a key point throughout the book. It is a key point in how to overcome or withstand the pain and the agony and the suffering. This point is that in the book of Job, whether you're talking about Job or talking about his friends, even in their disagreement, there is this incredible, great humility that they have before God. One of the key elements of the book is how both Job and even his friends behold God with great honor and reverence. At the same time, they realize they are nothing compared to God. He is so above them. He is so strong. He is so knowing, and they are nothing. Let's take a look as over and over their cases are based on the greatness of God. Let's look not at Job's words first, but let's go to Job 5. Job 5, beginning verse 8. This is the first of the friends to speak, Eliphaz. And look at what he says. Job 5, beginning in verse 8. Eliphaz says, "But as for me, I would seek God. I would place my cause before God, who does great and unsearchable things, wonders without number. He gives rain on the earth. He sends water on the fields, so that he sets on high those who are lowly, and those who mourn are lifted to safety. He frustrates the plotting of the shrewd, so that their hands cannot attain." And you just go through those verses and you'll see all these great things that God does. And I think one of the important points is as you're going through suffering, oftentimes you forget all the things God has done. It has that temptation to become so focused on the pain and the anguish. Let's take a look at Job's words in Job 9, beginning in verse 1. Job 9, verse 1, Job answered, "In truth, I know that this is so. But how can a man be in the right before God? If one wished to dispute with him, he could not answer him once and 1,000 times. Wise in heart and mighty in strength, who has defied him without harm? It is God who removes the mountains. They know not how. When he overturns them in his anger, who shakes the earth out of its place and its pillars tremble, who commands the sun not to shine and sets a seal upon the stars," and just keep going. All these great things that God does, his greatness. Job says, listen, no man can go up to God and say, "I am innocent." Now, throughout this entire story, Job maintains his integrity and his innocence. But what he is saying is, I might be innocent in this matter, but I'm still a sinner. Anytime you go before God, there's something he can bring up against you, not him. I think this is an important point in this book, a key point. Because what often happens is when people give up on God, when people say, well, there must not be an all-knowing, all-powerful, all-loving God because look at what he didn't do. He lets his people suffer. He could have stopped it. It's because people what? They don't have that true perspective of God. They're elevating themselves above God. They're lowering God down to them. To overcome whatever the trial might be, physical, mental, spiritual, you have to maintain that idea that God is so great and so mighty. I don't test him. I don't put him to the test. I trust him. I may not know why it's happening, but I'm not going to exalt myself over God. He doesn't have to answer to me. I might be innocent in this, but I am by no means innocent before God. That is so key to overcoming all of our trials. Next point, 5 or 6. I don't remember which one we're on. This is the point that often usually comes out in a study of the book of Job, and that is comforting one another. Giving advice. What we learn in the book of Job is there's a right way to give advice and comfort. There's a wrong way to do it. And no doubt his friends are a perfect illustration of what not to do. We mentioned before how Job's suffering was intensified simply by not knowing God's plan. It added to Job's suffering. But another element that made his anguish take flight was the advice of his friends and how they presented that advice. Let's look at Job chapter 7. Job chapter 7, beginning verse 13. I call this the watchers of men. Job 7 verse 13. Look at what Job says. He says, If I say, my bed will comfort me, my couch will ease my complaint, then you frighten me with dreams and terrify me by visions, so that my soul would choose suffocation, death, rather than my pains. Do you see what Job is saying there? He's saying, if there's anything that I could find some comfort, some relief of this pain and anguish, you would destroy it. If I told you my bed would give me comfort, then what? You're going to tell me things that are going to give me nightmares. So I can't sleep in comfort. Isn't that incredible how he says all that? Verse 17, what is man that you magnify him? And that you are concerned about him? That you examine him every morning and try him every moment? Will you never turn your gaze away from me, nor let me alone until I swallow my spittle? Have I sinned? What have I done to you, O watchers of men? Why have you set me as your target? You see what Job is saying? He's saying, you just have a target. You put a target on me and just keep watching and watching until I do the wrong thing, and then you're going to let me know about it. You know people like that? Let's take a look at Job 16, verse 1. Job chapter 16 and in verse 1. Then Job answered, I have heard many such things. Sorry comforters are you all. Is there no limit to windy words? Or what plagues you that you answer? I could speak like you. If I were in your place, I could compose words against you and shake my head at you. See what Job says? He says, you're sorry comforters. Your words are just a bunch of vain wind. He says, I could be like you. If I was in your place, if the tables were turned, I could do that. I could be like that. Or, look at verse 5, or I could do this. I could strengthen you with my mouth, and the solace of my lips could lessen your pain. He says, you could comfort me if you wanted to, but for some reason you don't. Let's look at Job 23, verse 6. Job 23, verse 6 and 7. Would he contend with me by the greatness of his power? He's talking about God here. No, surely he would pay attention to me. There the upright would reason with him, and I would be delivered forever from my judge. I believe what Job is saying here to his friends is, I'd rather take my case to God. As holy and perfect as he is, he would be a better comforter than you guys would be. If only I could do that. What did his friends do? They made his situation worse. They, as we like to say, put salt in his wound. And the next point, I think, explains why they were like that. The next point that comes from the book of Job is this: sometimes advice is nothing more than a desire to be right. You see, the problem with Job's friends is that they just knew that they were right. They were confident that they knew the cure for Job, and that was, of course, repentance. They knew he was a great sinner, and he was just ignoring them. And so over and over they tell him to humble himself, to repent of his horrendous sin. The silence was more comforting than their words, because when they spoke, it was not about consoling Job. It was about proving themselves. Let's take a look at some examples of that early on. Job chapter 4, beginning in verse 1. Job 4, verse 1. This again is Eliphaz speaking. Then Eliphaz the Temanite answered, "If one ventures a word with you, will you become impatient? But who can refrain from speaking? Behold, you have admonished many, and you have strengthened weak hands. Your words have helped the tottering to stand, and you have strengthened feeble knees." That sounds comforting, right? But look at this. "But now it has come to you, and you are impatient. It touches you, and you are dismayed. Is not your fear of God your confidence, and the integrity of your ways your hope? Remember now, whoever perished being innocent, or where the upright destroyed? According to what I have seen, those who plow iniquity and those who sow trouble harvest it." He says to Job, yeah, you were really good to other people, but now the tables are turned, and look at you now. Now you're pitiful. Now you're in denial of what the true problem is. Job chapter 8, verse 3. Look at this. Remember what happened to Job's children? Chapter 1. Satan killed them all. Left his wife, but took his children. Job chapter 8, verse 3. These are the words of Bildad, friend number 2. Verse 3 beginning. "Does God pervert justice? Or does the Almighty pervert what is right? If your sons sinned against him, then he delivered them into the power of their transgression." You know what he's saying there? He's saying, not only are you a sinner, but you know why your sons died? Because they were sinners too. They deserved it. Wow, that's great comfort. You ever have somebody that their advice to you is just, so dogmatic, and it's so exact, and it has no comfort in it at all, no consolation? That's the way his friends were. Let's take a look at one more. Actually, that was it that I wanted. So, there's a right way to give advice and a wrong way. There's a right way to comfort and a wrong way. And sometimes the right way is like where they began. You don't know what to say. You want to say something very profound, something very comforting, something very truthful, but you don't know what to say. Well, that might be your answer. Don't say anything. Let your presence be. Just be there for them. And finally, as we close, the last point that helps us from the book of Job is also another key to the book. And that is this: that the ultimate goal in suffering, to overcome by holding to your integrity and your faith, holding to your righteousness and your faith in God. And number 2, to never curse God. Never give up on God. Never put him to the test. Remember, the original challenge between Satan and God was to take the hedge that God had built around Job away so that so that Job would curse God. Job 1, 9 through 11. That same goal is in the second challenge, the second test, in chapter 2, verse 5. But go over to chapter 2, verse 9. Remember I said the goal is to hold to your integrity, hold to your faith, and not to curse God? Well, look at his wife. She's paying the price of this suffering. Like I said, it's just as hard sometimes on the loved one that's not going through it, but seeing their loved one go through it. So in Job chapter 2 and in verse 9, look at what his wife says. Look at the wording. Then his wife said to him, "Do you still hold fast to your integrity? Curse God and die." And of course, Job corrects her and says, no, that's not the goal. That's not how you handle that. Look, if you would, at Job 23, verse 10. Job 23, beginning in verse 10. Here are the words of Job's about God. "But he knows the way I take. When he has tried me, I shall come forth as gold. My foot is held fast to his path. I have kept his way and not turned aside." Even though his friends keep accusing him of being this horrendous sinner, he says, I know my way has not compromised. I know in the end I'm going to be found innocent and God's going to reward me. And then finally in Job 6 and in verse 10. Job 6 and in verse 10. Job says, "But it is still my consolation, and I rejoice in unsparing pain, that I have not denied the word of the Holy One." Despite all the suffering, even the crying, the complaining that Job went through, he held to his integrity. In fact, there's a whole chapter 31, about the integrity of Job, a challenging chapter about integrity. He held fast to his confidence, his faith, and his obedience in God. And I think the book of Job, as you go through trials in your life, can be a tremendous help with the perspective, the information, what we can know, what we can't know. We're going through it right now. Many of you know it. Many of you are going through it. Let Job be your book of wisdom. Let Job be that help from God. Thank you so much.